All right. Well, my name is Siegel, and on behalf of the Department of History, I'm very pleased to welcome you here today to the first in a series of panel discussions that we have organized in response to current events in the United States, but thinking as historians and trying very much to bring our expertise to bear on the many, many questions I think that a lot of us have had over weeks, if not months, at this point in watching transformations in the United States. So before we get started, I want to make sure to thank International Programs for the use of this space, the Global Lounge. I know this is my first time using it, and I think we're very inspired globally here, so we do very much appreciate that. And I also want to quickly announce the upcoming panels that we will have for the rest of the semester. So following this one, on Friday, March 10th, also at noon, some other members of the History Department and I will be talking about American immigration and Muslim Americans in historical perspective. That's in Tahoe, 1025. And then on April 13th, which is a Thursday at noon, we'll be talking about women's activism and reproductive rights in historical perspective. And that's in the Forest Suite of the University Union. I did bring a couple of extra copies of a handout that has all of that information on it, and they're on the table at the front here. So please feel free to pick one up when you leave if you would like information on that. I have to say the idea for holding a panel such as this one actually first came to me about a year ago. And at that point in time, the United States was in the middle of its primary season. The Republican field of candidates at that point in time had been reduced down to just 3 candidates. It was Ted Cruz and John Kasich and Donald Trump. And the debates were getting increasingly nasty. And Donald Trump was beginning to draw both attention and criticism for his attacks on foreigners and for non-whites in the United States, and also beginning to capture media attention for his rhetoric of putting America first. At the same time that that was going on in American culture, in my world civilization class that I teach almost every semester here at Sac State, I had just completed a unit on the rise of the Nazis to power in Germany in the 1930s. And at the end of that historically based lecture, one of my students raised her hand and posed a question to me that a student had never posed to me before in my history of teaching. And she said to me, "Professor Siegel, do you think that America could become like Nazi Germany?" And I was a bit swept off my feet. I hadn't thought that directly in those terms before, but clearly the rhetoric that this campaign at that point was taking on was beginning to make my students look differently at the United States. Fast forward to today, and of course Donald Trump has been elected to the presidency, although with less than a majority of the popular vote. And here at least is one parallel with Nazi Germany, in that the Nazis never won the majority vote in an open election in the 1930s as well. But since that time, and particularly since the inauguration on January 20th, countless commentators have asked in different forms the same question that my student posed to me. And essentially asking, could America become like Nazi Germany? Could democracy in America give way to dictatorship? To cite one example, a journalist at the Miami Herald ran an open letter last Tuesday to Donald Trump to draw attention to the comment that one of his advisors had made on TV. And so this is what the journalist wrote. He said, "Just last Sunday, senior policy advisor Stephen Miller declared on CBS's Face the Nation that, quote, our opponents, the media, and the whole world will soon see as we begin to take further actions that the powers of the president to protect our country are very substantial and will not be questioned." And then this journalist goes on to ask Trump rhetorically, "What you do will not be questioned? Lord have mercy." That's the kind of statement that in another time and place would have been greeted with an outthrust palm and a hearty Sieg Heil. Now these critiques are not only coming from the political left. This past Friday, just a couple of days ago, when Donald Trump tweeted that the mainstream media were, quote, the enemy of the American people, Republican Senator John McCain responded, quote, the first things that dictators do is to shut down the press. And I'm not saying that President Trump is trying to be a dictator. I am just saying that we need to learn the lessons of history. Now, to make things even more confusing, analogies to fascism and Nazism and populism and dictatorship are also being used by the Trump administration to try and discredit their enemies. President Trump's chief strategist, Steve Vann, has repeatedly insisted that America is at war with what he calls jihadist Islamic fascism. And prior to his inauguration, when Donald Trump heard that a classified FBI file had alleged links between his campaign and the Russian government, Trump tweeted in response, quote, one last shot at me, are we living in Nazi Germany? So these analogies are scary. I find them scary. I hope you find them scary. And in many cases, I think they're often used with relatively little thought or precision precisely to scare us and to make us act emotionally instead of rationally. But in other cases, the epithets fascist, Nazi, authoritarian, or populist are used to encourage us to look at the past. And for all that we Americans like to imagine that America is exceptional, that we don't fall prey to the same problems as other places in the world, in fact, our 200-plus-year-old democracy is fragile. And the American electorate, like voters in many other times and places, may in fact be just as willing to exchange their freedoms and rights for the elusive promises of authoritarian rule. So in an effort to try and understand the utility and also the limits of these types of comparisons, the History Department has compiled this panel of scholars. These are all colleagues of mine who regularly study authoritarian regimes in the past and the present, and who are trained to look for patterns in ideas and in movements over time, as well as to be attentive to the differences in these movements over time. And while their interpretations here today may vary, their analyses will be bound by the historical record, which is another way of saying that facts matter. And facts matter to us very much in this day and age that we're living in the United States. So I'm going to proceed now to introduce my fellow panelists here today. I have brought some questions in for them that I'm going to begin by posing to them to get the conversation started. And then I'm going to make sure to save some time at the end for you to ask questions that perhaps you have or that might stem from what was said today. So I'm going to ask you to please hold your questions for the end. Feel free to write them down so you don't lose track of them. And I'll call on people when we get to that stage of our presentation. So I'm going to introduce my panelists in alphabetical order. So I'm going to begin at the far end there with my colleague, Dr. Terry Fields. Dr. Fields is a lecturer in the History Department here at Sac State. She earned a master's degree in political science at UC Davis, where she examined the role of the military in late 20th century Argentina, and has a PhD in history, also from UC Davis, where she specialized in colonial Mexico. Her book, Pestilence and Head Colds, Encountering Illness in Colonial Mexico, is a study of lay notions about the body in New Spain. Dr. Katerina Lagos earned her doctorate in philosophy from Oxford University and is trained as a modern European historian with an expertise in Greece. Her doctoral dissertation focused on the Metaxas dictatorship of 1936 to 41 and its perception and treatment of Jewish communities in Greece. She has published on the Metaxas dictatorship, on Greek Jewry in the interwar period, and on interwar education policies toward foreign and minority schools. Dr. Michael Vann, sitting between them, received his PhD in history from the University of California at Santa Cruz, where he specialized in 20th century France, colonialism and imperialism, and revolution and counter-revolution in Southeast Asia and the global South. In addition to publications on the French Empire, which support Hannah Arendt's arguments that the roots of fascism can be found in Western imperialism, he is currently researching a comparative study of Cold War public history and memory in Indonesia, Vietnam, and Cambodia. And last but not least, Dr. Jeffrey Wilson is the chair of the History Department here at Sac State and a specialist in modern German history. He earned his PhD from the University of Michigan, where he specialized in the study of German nationalism. His book, The German Forest, Nature, Identity, and the Contestation of a National Symbol, 1871 to 1914, explores the competing visions of German national identity before the First World War. So we have quite the panel of experts here before us today, and I want to go ahead and get started by posing a question to my colleague, Dr. Wilson. Since many of the comparisons that I raised in my introduction here today directly draw on our knowledge of Nazi Germany, I wonder if you could begin by telling us what it is that the Nazi Party stood for, and whether you see Nazism and fascism to be the same thing.
Okay, well, thank you, Mona, and thank you for organizing this panel. This is really a fantastic opportunity for us to sort of use our historical expertise to some effect. So the question is, what do the Nazis stand for, and how is it connected to fascism? Well, I see Nazism as a sort of variant of a larger fascist movement, which, of course, the term fascism coming from the Italian Fascist Party and then being emulated and elaborated on in different historical contexts. In the case of Nazi Germany, and fascists more generally, the root is an extreme nationalism. A nationalism, first of all, nationalism being the idea that one's national identity, one's often ethnic identity, is one's most important identity. And it's radical in the sense that fascists and Nazis called on individuals to subordinate themselves to the cause of the nation. That the nation was the most important value in one's life, and one had to sacrifice one's own interests for the sake of the nation. This is also radical, particularly in the Nazi case, because this was not just about subordinating one's own desires for the national will, but also that this was an expansionist nationalism, one that argued that Germany should be and Germans should be dominant, and that this was at the heart of German nationalism, or German radical nationalism for the Nazis. Another element that's critical here is the desire to overcome what the Nazis saw as a crisis. Now, certainly Germany was in crisis in the early 1930s because of the Great Depression, but the Nazis saw the crisis being larger than this. They regarded the crisis as having its origins in the First World War and Germany's defeat in the First World War, and they aimed, their first aim was to sort of undo that defeat, to take Germany back to its pre-war status as a major power, major European power. But beyond that, then to engage in territorial expansionism, first in Europe and then beyond. But they saw Germany's defeat as the product not of its defeat on the battlefield, but as the product of internal undermining by forces that were alien to Germany. And among those forces, primarily they saw as Jews, Jews being sort of cosmopolitan, not tied to the values that Germans held dear, according to the Nazis, as well as socialists. Socialists and communists who the Nazis argued had undermined Germany's war effort from within, stabbing German troops at the front and the back. This is the myth of the stab in the back, the idea that Germany did not lose the First World War on the battlefield, but rather had lost it because of traitors within the nation. So this crisis of traitors within Germany's midst, holding Germany back, preventing Germany from achieving or retaining its superior position, was something that the Nazis then sought to address. They aimed to exclude these traitors from German society. Building on this, then, the Nazis also believed that that really any means necessary could be used to marginalize and eliminate these traitors. So the belief that law and tradition and custom no longer mattered. What was essential was, in this time of crisis, to sort of eliminate the sort of alien forces within Germany's midst. Now, in the process of eliminating traitors or those disloyal groups, those alien groups who were seen as undermining Germany, it was also necessary from the Nazi point of view to create greater national unity, to bring the nation together, those regarded as belonging to the nation, in a greater national unity, emphasizing national identity over class identity, religious identity, whatever other identities people might hold as important. And particularly here, the campaign against the socialists and the communists was more important because communists and socialists saw sort of class identity as one's most important identity. So, you know, doing away with class identities, emphasizing that, you know, the struggle between labor and employers was not important. What was important was the struggle of Germans against non-Germans. So this was central. And then finally, you know, creating this sort of unified nation, getting rid of the outsiders. This also was connected with the idea of subordination to a leader. That democracy, you know, led to everyone sort of asserting their own interests, and so getting rid of democracy and having everyone subordinate themselves to a leader, a selfless leader who held, you know, the nation's interests to heart was important. And this leader and everyone who sort of followed the leader needed to recognize that the importance of instinct over reason. That you know, one shouldn't sort of try to sort of think things out too much. One should act based on one's gut reaction. And particularly the leader's gut reaction, and following that leader's gut reaction was sort of central here to the idea of subordination to the leader.
So let me ask you then, it sounds like the Nazis, even in the 20s, long before they came to power, were quite open about their anti-socialism, their anti-communism, their extreme nationalism, anti-Semitism. They were already building up a movement around a charismatic leader, Adolf Hitler in this case. But as I mentioned in my introduction, the Nazis came to power legally, right? Yeah. Although I think the highest percentage of the vote that the Nazi Party ever got was just a little bit over 37%. Yeah. So if they came to power legally, Hitler wasn't appointed dictator, right? He was appointed prime minister. How is it in a relatively short period of time that the Nazis moved from being the largest vote-getting party in a democratic government to running a dictatorship?
Well, I mean, you say Hitler wasn't appointed as a dictator, and you know, one might, to some extent, there can be some debate around that. Under the Weimar Constitution, the Constitution of the German Republic, before the Nazis came to power, the president of the Republic held a great deal of authority, particularly under Article 48 of the Weimar Constitution, which allowed the president to permit the chancellor to rule by decree in cases of emergency. So in the case of Germany, we have a series of elections during the Depression in the early 1930s, where the Nazis are getting a larger and larger percent of the vote. The traditional parties see a decline in their vote. But the conservative elites who are sort of calling the shots are reluctant to cooperate with the Nazis. They see Hitler as a kind of lower middle class rabble-rouser, politically inexperienced. They don't want to include him. But they do, the conservative elites who are running Germany in 1925, we see the election of Paul von Hindenburg as German president. He's one of the leaders of the German war effort in the First World War, a kind of arch-conservative aristocrat who wants to undo the republic and establish a more authoritarian form of government. During the Great Depression, backs a couple of chancellors before Hitler who ruled by Article 48, who ruled by decree because during the Depression, basically parliamentary government breaks down. There can be no sort of majority found for any particular policies in reaction to the economic crisis. And so by 1932, the Nazis are getting, in the July election, 37, almost 38% of the vote. And conservative elites who want to create a more authoritarian style of government don't trust Hitler, but they see his anti-democratic movement perhaps as a tool that they can use to undo the republic and establish a more authoritarian government more to their liking. And so after a series of negotiations, finally Hitler and the conservatives come together in January of 1933, with Hitler being appointed chancellor, but having only a minority of Nazis actually as ministers in the government, the majority are sort of traditional conservatives. And the conservatives at the time, Franz von Papen, who is the vice chancellor and the kind of architect of this arrangement, makes the comment when someone says to him, "Oh, isn't this Hitler a dangerous guy? Isn't he going to take over?" And von Papen says, "It's all right. We've got him in such a tight corner. In a couple of months we'll have him, playing to our tune." That, turns out to be one of the great underestimations of German history and world history. So once Hitler becomes chancellor, he moves quite rapidly to establishing dictatorial conditions. Within 4 weeks, actually 4 weeks from the day that he becomes chancellor, a mysterious fire breaks out in the Reichstag, in the German parliament building. He announces that this was the sort of signal for a communist uprising. The communists, of course, one of the arch enemies of the Nazis, and moves within hours. And so here, clearly the Nazis are anticipating a kind of event like this. Within hours, rounding up communists, jailing about 10,000 communists in the coming weeks. The following day, issuing a law limiting civil liberties in this time of national crisis, cracking down on, shutting down newspapers, limiting the freedom of speech, freedom of assembly, and so on, and really creating sort of conditions for dictatorship. And within a few weeks later, then, under intimidation, sort of pressuring the Reichstag to approve then the Enabling Act, which essentially suspended the powers of the Reichstag for a number of years, allowing Hitler to actually act as a dictator. And there are other sort of smaller measures that he takes in the meantime, but those are that's the big events in that timeline.
So it sounds like the Reichstag fire was an important turning point in the suspension of civil liberties and proceeding to silence the opposition in Germany. So maybe to move on, to bring more panelists into this discussion, obviously once the Nazis came to power, and particularly, well, even before World War II broke out, many other states in Europe in the 1930s also turned to strongmen to try and pull them out of what they were defining as a state of crisis. And this was true in Western Europe, it was true in Central Europe, and in Southern Europe too. So Dr. Lagos, this was true, I know, also in the country you study, which is Greece. Can you tell us a little bit about how Greece was transformed into a dictatorship by Metaxas in the 1930s? And also explain whether or not you think fascism is an appropriate label for the type of authoritarian government that was created in Greece.
Thank you, Mona. So the Metaxas dictatorship from 1936 to 1941.
I'm sorry, can you all hear in the back? I want to make sure. Okay.
Has been accused by both scholars of the left and scholars of the right as being a fascist for different reasons. And Metaxas's assumption of power has been a hotly debated one, and I think that literature now really has progressed. So he comes in, Greece was defeated, actually emerged victorious out of World War I, and then was promptly defeated by Turkey, the Ottoman Empire, and leading to the Treaty of Lausanne in 1923, a very truncated kind of state. This defeat did not echo so much in Greece for the rise of a fascist dictatorship. The big problem that's going to be consuming Greece from 1923 up until 1936 is called the National Schism, this division in Greece that originated over Greece's entry into World War I. And having multiple governments. Every month you will have a government that will rise and fall. So by the 1930s, following the Great Depression, you see various extremist groups on the rise, all asking for some sort of stability. How does Metaxas come into the picture? He was a very well-known military general who studied in Germany, comes in and didn't like the parliamentary process, part of which was because he wasn't popular. He was not a very charismatic individual. He had a very marginalized party. So when he comes and tries to participate in the political process, a freak event actually happens in 1936 in Greece. 6 of the leading politicians passed away due to natural causes, not natural causes, which opened up space for other individuals to come in. So in 1936 in April, the king in power, King George II, offers John Metaxas, the opportunity to be interim prime minister. So his transition into power is a legal one. Comes in. By the summer of 1936, there are various national strikes, worker strikes, and this is being appropriated by the right, including Metaxas, as being communist instigated, communist organized. And so there's going to be a massive national strike on August 5th, 1936. So Metaxas has to plead with the king, please give me dictatorial powers, and he is granted them. So on the night of August 3rd, going into the 4th, all the parliamentary leaders are brought into the parliament, and Metaxas said, I'm bringing you in to talk about this impending strike, but also to announce that I am forming a dictatorship. So he comes into power. The structure of the dictatorship has been debated, and like the very concept of fascism. What is fascism? How do you define it? And you've got many scholars across the world are going to say, no, this is fascism, this is not, many debates. So for Metaxas, he saw fascism. He didn't aspire to be a fascist dictator. There were others who passed away who did. There were members of his regime who were avowed fascist-leaning, Germanophile type of individuals, neo-Nazis at that time. Metaxas comes in, and he wants stability. And the other big issue that he's facing is pressure from the West, i.e. Italy, and their expansionist campaign, La Mare Nostrum, expanding the Italian Empire. And one of the targets of this empire is going to be poor Greece. So for Metaxas, his big issue is stability, control, and in this process of control, we see this kind of remilitarization, and you see all of these youth groups being organized in their military garb to celebrate the strength and the unity of the Greeks. As for discrimination, you think of discrimination of minorities. For Metaxas, the minority he really actively wanted to discriminate is the left, those who were against him coming to power. As for other traditional minorities living in Greece, you had a large Muslim community, a Jewish communities, because there are various kinds of patchwork, and others. He never took on legislation to actively discriminate against them. There was no Jewish question for Metaxas in Greece. For him, the big question is to reconcile the big divide that had existed in the country and prepare the country, as he foresaw, as an impending European conflict. So he comes into power in 36, and by 1938, he's already seen Greece and all of Europe on the path to war. So his big concern is actually to keep Greece out of the conflict. His big thing is not to look and to acquire an empire. He looked inward, and he said, yes, I'm going to harken back, kind of like the Germans did, the Italians did. The Greeks looked back to antiquity, but not for any military campaign, but for an internal intellectual campaign to create a third Greek civilization that would kind of echo and bring forth the intellectual genius of the ancient Greeks. So this was his big campaign to move forward Greeks intellectually, but ultimately stay out of a conflict and basically exclude the left that were pushing against him and attempted overthrows of his dictatorship and have control. So to kind of sum up, he borrows many aspects of the criteria that most scholars would consider fascist, yet to other extents he does not. That his big thing is to control, solidify the breaks that existed in Greece, and to emerge in the impending conflict that he saw on the horizon to come out relatively unscathed and not dismembered as he had feared.
So it sounds like here we have an example of yet another government that from the outset had a ruler that was hostile to parliament, hostile to power sharing, hostile to the rule of law even, but that was perhaps more inward looking and less outwardly imperialistic or expansionist, in part because of its situation in Europe and the threat of Italians on their border. So obviously, or maybe not so obviously, all these various fascist and authoritarian governments were toppled in World War II. That was part of the British and American victory in 1945 and the very straightforward denazification and re-education programs. But I don't think that means that fascism and dictatorship went away as well, and that's part of why I want to turn to my panelists at the end of the table, and particularly to Dr. Vann first. If we look at Asia, which is one of your areas of expertise, certainly the government of General Suharto in Indonesia, which lasted for over 30 years, is one example of a government that was nationalistic, anti-liberal, authoritarian. But there's others that we could point to as well. Ferdinand Marcos in the Philippines, President Diem in South Vietnam, Park Chung-hee in South Korea. These are all governments that were dictatorial, that were backed by the United States, at least at various points in time in their rule. Would you think, and described as fascist by their opponents. So is this an appropriate use of the term fascism for these regimes that you study? And if it is, why was America, that had been fighting fascism in the 1940s, supporting these governments in the 1950s and 60s?
Thank you, Mona, and thank all of you for turning out on this beautiful, lovely day in Northern California. Talking about fascism, there's two big problems. First is that fascism is the F word. It is completely degenerated into a catch-all insult that in popular usage really has no meaning. It's just the ultimate insult for a political opponent. We saw this a few years ago with Tea Party activists calling Obama a fascist. Even Bill Maher remarked on the absurdity of calling George W. Bush a fascist. Bill Maher pointed out that W and Hitler had no similarities. Hitler was a decorated war veteran, a beautiful public speaker, and showed some talent as an artist. So he said, there's no comparison. That was my one joke, and it was plagiarized. Actually, I footnoted it, so it wasn't plagiarized. So it starts to lose all meaning if we overuse it as this catch-all insult. Also, there's another problem, and that really stems from the academy, in which the way that fascism has been talked about in the university, with very, very strong Eurocentric blinders. We really only want to use fascism to describe the events in Europe between 1919 and 1945, and that somehow other examples around the world are not fascist. I used to be very much within that camp. I only called regimes fascist if they thought they were fascists. I used to teach there's really only two fascist regimes that hit Mussolini's Italy and Hitler's Germany, arguably Romania. We can go down a scale from there. But I think it's evolved on this dramatically, and particularly the study of Southeast Asia and the Cold War has changed that. So if we can roughly define fascism as an extreme form of nationalism, not necessarily genocidal, an extreme form of nationalism, that draws upon a mythical national past as the product of a crisis of liberal democracy and industrial capitalism and their unresolved conflicts, as the rejection of democratic and republican state practice in favor of a single sovereign leader who claims to be above all domestic political problems, as violently anti-labor, be it union or political party, but violently anti-labor, that uses, there's a contradictory use of victimization and strength. The fascist leader speaks to our victimization, but also our power in the appeal to the masses. The use of a mass party and state ideology to force unity upon the nation state as part of a backlash against destabilizing cultural forces, be it Jews in Germany in the 1920s and 1930s, or aspects of cultural modernity that some of these leaders find destabilizing and some of their supporters find destabilizing. And then finally, and I think this is very important and oftentimes overlooked in the literature, a misogynist cult of hyper-masculinity that claims to establish so-called traditional gender roles and is explicitly anti-feminist in its rhetoric and policies. And that gender component is really strong throughout all of the regimes I think you can categorize as fascist, but frequently set aside in terms of focusing on the militarism, on the anti-communism. So if we expand our thinking beyond Europe and beyond the demise of the fascist regimes in 1945, if we look at the Cold War, there's many post-colonial states that go through similar crises as Europe did in the previous decades that led to a rejection of democracy in favor of authoritarian regimes. And in my little corner of the world, Southeast Asia, and we'll say some words in regards to Latin America, but in my little corner of the world, Southeast Asia, we see a number of regimes coming up with authoritarian, if not fascist solutions to this these multiple crises of liberal democracy and capitalism. And they all occur in this breakdown of democracy, these tensions of capitalist developments, but also this is the Cold War, so in the context of a global Red Scare. Central to Mussolini's rule, Nazi Germany, Greece in the dictatorship is the enemy of communism. And what's going on in the world from 1949 to 1989? The global Red Scare, the Cold War. And the anti-communist rhetoric, especially in Southeast Asia, is absolutely central. So if we look around Asia, Suharto in Indonesia, yeah, I'll say a few more words on that. I think you would classify as fascist. Ferdinand Marcos in the Philippines, not so much, not so much. Many of these things in common, but really not a fascist. Park in South Korea, perhaps. Diem in South Vietnam. I would say he was definitely heading down the path of fascism until he's assassinated by his own men. That's a sign that your dictatorship is going poorly. When your own men assassinate you and kill you. So Indonesia under Suharto is the big case here. And as Dr. Siegel mentioned, this is the regime that governs for 32 years, from 1966 to 1998. I actually visited Indonesia in 1990 under the Suharto dictatorship. And from landing in the airport, aspects of the dictatorship were very, very clear, including they would search your baggage for anything printed in Chinese, because that could be a vehicle for the spread of communism. It also showed the Sinophobia. Instead of an anti-Semitism, there's a very strong Sinophobia in this regime. So Suharto's Indonesia, you just look at the name. Suharto called his regime the New Order. You know who else called their regime the New Order? Nazi Germany. Ding, 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 red flag number one, right? The regime came to power through violent means, but with a legal pretext. They claimed there was an attempted coup against the existing president, very similar to the Reichstag fire, and an upstart general led a seizure of the state, which he then got justified by some legal paperwork, very similar to the Enabling Act in Nazi Germany. And this unleashed a widespread campaign of violence against the Communist Party, the Indonesian Communist Party, which was the largest communist party outside the Soviet Union or the People's Republic of China at the time. Somewhere between 500,000 and 3 million people were killed in the space of a year for being members of the party or associated with the party. We don't know how many, but when you're counting in rough hundreds of thousands, that is truly horrifying. And that the regime was based upon a repeated big lie. And this is a tactic from Nazi Germany. Keep hammering the big lie, the big lie, the big lie. And the big lie here was that the communists were going to take over Indonesia in 1965, and General Suharto came in on a white horse. He actually came in on a green Jeep, but came in and saved the day from everyone, and he knew best. The regime itself, for 32 years, used a state party and a state ideology to create order, and Suharto constantly represented himself as forging unity with this, via the party, via this ideology that was taught in the schools, in the civil service. You see a militarization of all aspects of life. Civil servants wear uniforms at this time and have to abide by these state principles and ideologies. There's also a number of ceremonies that directly draw upon some of the imagery that will look more familiar in Europe in the 1930s, with various rallies and the importance placed upon militaristic uniforms. And
I'm going to ask you to wrap it up.
Yeah, well, good, because I'm on my last point. So that I think this is all to say that we need to get beyond sort of Eurocentric uses of the term fascism and use it as a global category of analysis for a variety of cases around the world. And that can sort of save it from being this overused political insult to something that's actually much more meaningful.
Great. So, Dr. Fields, because I want to bring in a little bit of Latin American history here. So one of the definite commonalities we've heard about all three of the governments we looked at today is they were strongly anti-communist. They were trying to do away with class language and drawing support, in some cases anyway, directly from the right, more traditional right. So I know that authoritarian rule has been a tool also of parties that have refused labels like that, and also that appeal very directly to the working class. And I'm thinking particularly of Juan Perón in Argentina. So I wonder if you could draw on that expertise of yours to tell us a little bit about Juan Perón's rise to power in the 40s and 50s, and the type of authoritarian populism that built up around he and his wife Evita in particular.
And I'm going to truncate my comments because I see that we're running out of time. I'm going to save you there. So the thing about Perón that I want to emphasize, and I'm not going to emphasize fascism because I think it's important to talk about populism and this sort of psychological connection that a leader has with a certain group of followers. Now Perón sort of embodies that, in my opinion, as in the way does Trump. So Perón comes to power at a very specific time in Latin America. In Latin America, the Great Depression had thrown a lot of these larger countries like Brazil and Argentina and Mexico into economic crisis. And so what they do is they completely shift their model of economic development. They shift away from market capitalism that is based on exports to something called import substitution industrialization. Now what this does is it throws out the tenets of market capitalism and it brings the state in. The state now this is not Marxist though, the state now will come and control vital sectors of the economy, and Perón comes to power in the 1940s in a military dictatorship where he is given the post of labor secretary. The working class in Argentina has doubled in just the space of 10 years, as have the factories. The power of this working class is absolutely untapped politically. He sees this. He cultivates a relationship with them. He really goes out of his way to get wage raises for them and better working conditions. So in his space, in his capacity as labor secretary, he cultivates this following very, very quickly, this emotional following. Now, the military government is very threatened by this. So they arrest Perón. They arrest him, and the working class go crazy. They come out into the streets. They come out into the streets of Buenos Aires and they demand his release. Of course, the military sees the writing on the wall. They release Perón, and Peronism is born at this moment. Elections are called for 1946. He wins handily. The day after the election, he, of course, marries a woman named Eva Duarte. And together, they cultivate and they create this state that channels funds and support to this working class now. So this working class, essentially what they do is they bring this working class into a political space, giving it a political space. But it's not that democratic. It is not Marxist. They are worried about Marxist unions. So what Perón does is Perón cultivates this for the state to control the unions. So this is giving the union space, giving the unions power, but as it's completely controlled by the state. Any kind of unions, like communist unions, this will all be snuffed out. Now, of course, Peronism and populism is very popular in Argentina, and it's very successful for a short amount of time. The Perones use the state to dole out funds for the workers, to increase wages for the workers, and the standard of living for workers does rise quite well.
I'm gonna ask you to wrap it up. I'm sorry.
Yeah, this falls apart, obviously, and he is overthrown in a coup in 1955. And Eva is dead, alas.
So let me pick up with Juan Perón there, and I want to bring this conversation back to the present and use our historical knowledge maybe a little bit more directly here at the end of our talk to think about America today as well as to think about the regimes you talked about. So you talked about this kind of cult around Juan Perón, and actually many of or maybe all of the rulers you talked about have this kind of hyped up cult of personality around them. So I want to ask any of you who'd like to respond. Many commentators have also noted Donald Trump's propensity for turning all conversations back to himself. And I mean, I probably could choose any number of examples. I think in particular of the comments he made during Black History Month just a few weeks ago, where he started talking about the importance of Black history and immediately switched over and began talking about how he was the most popular president among the Black electorate in history, which of course is not backed by the facts. So my specific question to you is, do you think Donald Trump is a charismatic leader in the same mold of the rulers you discussed? And do you think the Trump administration is building up a cult of personality in ways that are reminiscent to some of these leaders in the past? So do you want to start?
Yeah, I don't really see that Trump has charisma. Maybe that's just because he doesn't have charisma for me. But I do see that he has tapped into an emotional nerve in the American electorate. And I think that they respond to him. I think they respond to his language. I think he puts it in terms that electorate can understand. So that's what I think he's tapped into. Charisma, I'm not sure.
I profoundly disagree. I think he's incredibly charismatic, as was Adolf Hitler, who doesn't have a charisma that appealed to me personally. Maybe not speaking German, but I mean, in his defense, this is a mere moment here, Trump was right in that the media did not cover the phenomenon of those campaign rallies during the primary and into the general election. And I mean, how many rallies was he holding a day with huge numbers? And people were lining up and keeping those audiences pumped up and the enthusiasm. He's dripping with charisma. But what do you expect? I mean, he's a reality TV star. I mean, and he doesn't do anything except for sell his name. His whole business model is on selling the Trump brand. So he is dripping with a certain charisma that has a profound appeal to enough of a demographic in the United States to win the Electoral College.
So let me follow up with another question. You talked about his reality TV past there, and another difference of Donald Trump's that the media is very much picked up on is the fact that he's our first tweeting president, right? That he's kind of up late at night and sending out a message directly to us via social media. So I'm wondering, for my experts up here, how would you assess Trump's use of social media? And is this unprecedented? Or is the use of mass media reflect practices of past authoritarian leaders? Do you want to?
Well, yeah, of course, Hitler was famous, and the Nazi regime were famous for their use of the mass media. I mean, particularly radio, Hitler giving speeches on the radio, and subsidizing the production of radios, so-called people's receivers, that, so people could, in the privacy of their own homes, receive the message, as well as, radio broadcasts in public, where people would be less inclined to sort of shake their fists at the radio. So, yeah, I mean, there is, and then, to get back to this sort of issue of the big lie, I think, part of Trump's appeal, and I think, this is very much, part of the Nazis' appeal as well, Hitler's appeal, was the effort to reduce, complex questions to sort of simple answers, appealing to the lowest common denominator, turning every issue into a black or white issue, sort of simply, giving simple explanations, and that has broad appeal, rather than the kind of complex answers that we're giving up here.
But there's also the factor he's actually appealing to a need that many people in this country have, and that is we want a job, we want a living wage. So he appeals to a certain demographic, like, I will deal with you directly. So it goes beyond the emotional kind of connection. I feel, I understand you, you're drawn to me for charisma. It is that aspect. Give me my job back. And Hitler says, I want to have jobs back. I will revive this. And it is very male-dominated and appeals to, I will give you that type of honor and dignity and a job.
I think we can just flip that right upside down, because there is no policy. It's just platitudes and gibberish and hashtag MAGA, Make America Great Again. It is that big lie and that vague, charismatic platitudes that is central to fascism. I mean, you look at Hitler's speeches talking about how to avenge Germany from the evils of the Treaty of Versailles and an alleged conspiracy of international Judaism and capitalism, and there is no real program there. It's this emotional appeal. It's going to make you feel better, and the details.
But I was talking about the campaign promise, and you're also predicating after Hitler, Mussolini are gone. So at this point, 60 days in, you're going to have to wait to see if a policy comes.
But other politicians in campaigns actually have programs. And there is actually stuff on websites and political. I mean, this is a tradition in the United States that there is some substance, not just vague promises.
So let me ask, this is building on this question, but turning it a little bit. Both Dr. Lagos and Dr. Vann, you raised this question of masculinity as a tool. And certainly Donald Trump has made manhood great again in America, I guess, right? Or certainly made it part of our discussion of greatness again. He openly questioned his Republican opponent's manhood over the course of those debates. He famously labeled Hillary Clinton a nasty woman when they were debating together. And of course he was and is haunted by allegations of sexism and actually sexual assault. This is a small point, but I particularly noted just shortly after he was elected, maybe you all know this, he was he was chosen Time Magazine's Person of the Year. And I don't know if you heard, his response was, well, thank you, I'm honored to be the Person of the Year, but what I'd really like to be is the Man of the Year, right? So that label meant something more to him. And so I guess this hyped up masculinity in authoritarian regimes, is that something that you find, I guess, alarming in the rhetoric of the current administration, and is it reminiscent of the regimes you studied? What about Suharto? Is he...
Not so much. Actually, his predecessor, they talk more about it. I mean, it's just... I can't believe that a national political debate for the primary season in the opening minutes addressed the penis size of one of the candidates. It's not funny. It's not funny. That is insane. That is so beyond the pale of any respectable aspect of political discourse in the American or the greater Democratic Republican tradition.
It's true, but many commentators have noted that part of Trump's appeal to particularly a white male electorate has been selling his manhood. And so
This is my point.
I want to understand, it feels very new and different, at least out in the open in contemporary American politics. But, having studied Mussolini and Hitler, for example, it felt very, very familiar.
I mean, Mussolini, famous images of him harvesting grain, bare-chested, and, driving around in fast cars. He very much cultivated the image of a man's man. Hitler, of course, sort of physically doesn't strike us as, nearly as imposing as Mussolini, but nonetheless, rhetorically, Hitler again and again sort of emphasized the necessity of masculine values, of hardness, of brutality, as being sort of necessary to cultivate. And the Nazis, of course, had, a tradition of sort of elevating a particular type of, masculinity, particularly the sort of physically modeled on sort of the classical Greek, ideal of sort of lean, muscular, white men. So, there is a strong tradition of that, and also a strong tradition of sort of emphasizing, as Mike pointed out, a traditional division of gender roles with...
Well, yeah, I guess I wanted to follow up and just say that in fascist Europe, that came along with the criminalization of contraception, with even harsher anti-abortion policies, and often very strong pushes for to push women back into the domestic sphere.
And what this appeal is selling, this hyper-masculine appeal is selling, is a profound anti-feminism, again, both in rhetoric and in policies. And that is across the board in all of these fascist regimes.
So we only have a few moments left here. We perhaps can linger a little bit, but I do want to ask, give all of you an opportunity to at least pose a couple questions to our panelists here. So I see Chris raising his hand in the very back, so I'm going to start back there, and then we'll see what we have time for.
Yeah. So these conversations are so highly politicized, right now, that I think there might be folks in the room or folks that elsewhere on campus who might be thinking, of course, this, it's a liberal institution, right? It's a leftist institute. Universities, that's what they're like. So of course we're having this discussion on comparing and contrasting, Trump with this way. So I'm just wondering, as representatives of the academy, right, as representatives of the field of historians, how do you respond to that? Because sometimes it feels really hard to even just have this discussion, like an open, honest kind of discussion about this stuff.
Good. So are we just a bunch of knee-jerk liberals up here, colleagues, or how do we respond to this really good question? Katerina, you want to start?
I think our job as scholars is to explain historical concepts, explain historical events. We are not here to tell you what to think. We're teaching you how to think. Whether that, whatever you conclude, agrees with us or disagrees with us. But I think what's important for the academe and academia in general is that we can have these discussions without insulting each other, without yelling at each other, without beating each other up. I think that when people walk out of the room and say, you know what, I didn't know that, or, I disagree with that person, yet you walk out with more knowledge and something gained from a conversation. And I think us talking to each other, whether we agree or disagree, promotes that dialogue and promotes a furthering of understanding for a given concept, i.e. here, fascism.
Let me take another question. Yeah.
I was wondering about, listening to the panel discussion, the role of nationalism and national identity in either both facilitating the rise of fascist types of governments or in opposing the rise of nationalist type governments. Because the way I kind of looked at history is that when the mainstream political powers that be either failed to come to grips with or define a national identity, they allow the fringe to do so, and then people follow the definitions of the fringe. We see that in Nazi Germany as probably the best example. But what I'm looking at is more of like United States during the Cold War, during the 1950s and 60s. We had this national identity not based on ethnicity, but based on the ideas of liberty. And then during that time, we see the rise of the civil rights movement and a very inclusive type of national identity. And therefore, we didn't see during the Cold War a rise toward authoritarianism here in the United States.
So the question, if I understand it, is there a danger in leaving nationalism and national identity to the right as a political issue?
Well, correct. Either right or left, the fringe. The mainstream needs to come to grips with it.
Yeah, I don't know that that's necessarily the case in Germany. During the Weimar Republic, really all the political parties, from obviously the Nazis all the way through the Communist Party, rejected the Treaty of Versailles. So it's not like, the Treaty of Versailles and Germany's loss of great power status was only an issue for the Nazis. Everybody sort of rallied against it. It's not that the Nazis sort of captured the, definition of Germanness. It was just that their sort of more extreme version of that was sort of more appealing to a broader audience at the time than other more kind of sort of less aggressive things.
Well, let me take that same question and turn it on its head, because nationalism, as I believe as the Trump campaign has used it, has been about internal unity, but it's also been about defining outsiders as well, right? And certainly the attempted immigration ban that the administration is trying to put in place right now is in part a way not of just protecting the nation, but of defining who is a part of the nation. So I guess from these historical examples, is nationalism, is it always both a project of who's in, but also a project of who's out?
Nationalism is racism, nationalism is xenophobia. It is an irrational belief in this mythical conception of the nation that defines who you are not. It is probably the most destructive ideology in human history. Of all the flags that matter here, the only one that really matters is that blue one over there. I mean, it's especially in an age of profound environmental crisis, to continue with national thinking is going to be the demise of humanity.
So, I'm sorry, let me go ahead and turn to you guys. I'm sorry, I'm going to take Antoine in the front and we'll take you next, okay?
Sorry. Speaking of environmental crisis, something that I was curious of is the role of multinational corporations and non-government organizations, and like the selling of national debts and stuff like that. I was curious if anyone wanted to touch on if and how that plays a role in fascism or authoritarianism, and these countries, as we say, are developing nations. They've been developing for half a century. So I don't know if anyone wanted to touch on that. Like Greece, for example, with Germany on its debt and stuff like that.
Currently.
Is it still current?
Greece has been in debt since it got independent. So,
but like during the denazification period, it's like Germany's national debt was forgiven, and now Germany is one of the most prolific nations in the world right now. So I don't know if anyone wants to touch on like national debts, NGOs, multinational corporations, and its roles.
I'll be very brief since I've talked a lot. Greece right now is petitioning Germany to give back money. They fear called Nazi gold, as in the funds that were taken out of Greece during the war. And the Germans are saying, no, we've given you plenty. You need to deal with your economy, which is in shambles. Sorry, I'll speak a little bit louder. But they see it as an issue of pride being divorced, as always being a tool, as being somehow having to pay the price for external politics, i.e. big politics. So it's kind of like a European colony. We have to buy German goods. We can't even buy Japanese goods. So seeing these debts kind of as a burden on them and impeding them from having any sort of independence on their own, kind of like political free will to go about as they see.
And I guess, Anton, maybe another way of posing your question, but a little bit more generally, is one of the big explanations that I've read for the appeal of Donald Trump to many voters in America is that they're feeling alienated by globalization, which is another way of saying global capitalism, right? That they're feeling threatened by these forces of globalization. But those were forces that at least the fascist powers in Europe, I know, very directly spoke to in Europe as well, right? I mean, part of the Nazis' economic policy was about isolationism, at least until World War II broke out and they depended on the slave labor of the rest of Europe. So,
you know, and in Latin America, especially at the time of Perón, that also has tinges of anti-colonialism, because Latin America is still kind of under the thumb of European powers. They're the ones that came in and put in all the infrastructure. They're the ones that brought the railroads. And so Argentina, especially under Perón, is able to pay off the national debt because of this ISI economic policy and this rapid industrialization. So that enemy, I think if politically we're talking about, you know, there's always got to be a them out there. Like Chavez had the United States. You know, for Perón, it was the British. You know, there's always that international element.
So we have an eager question back here. Let's go ahead and turn to you.
Sorry.
Oh, no, that's great.
So a large part of this lecture was comparing Trump to many of the quote fascist, you know, leaders or dictatorship leaders, right? But many of those dictatorship leaders that they were compared to had mass support behind them. You know, the working class of Argentina, the poor people from the Great Depression in Germany. What my question is what comparisons would you draw between the people that support Trump and the people that supported those dictatorships? I've heard a couple, but...
Good, so a question about popular appeal, right, and then the constituencies of these dictatorships.
Well, I know in Argentina, I mean, the working class was defined by the elite as the rabble. So there, what I see is there's sort of this cultural war we're having between, you know, white working class or working class and the coastal elites. You know, we listen to different media. We live in different worlds. It's like we live in different planets. You know, that was absolutely stark in Argentina at that time. Because the elite, the old landowning class and the industrializing class loathed the working class. And the working class loathed them back. I mean, you can just see that in the Rome.
Yeah, and I would say, you know, there is a parallel in Germany as well, that there is a strong sort of class structure, a strong sort of polarization between the sort of working class and the middle class. And one of the things that made Nazism so appealing was that German politics had traditionally been organized along class lines. You had socialist and communist parties that appealed to workers, you had liberals and conservatives that appealed to middle class people, and the Nazis were saying, forget all of that, forget class, we're going to unite the nation, we're going to bring together people of different classes for the greater good. And Trump, I don't know, certainly he, you know, he's making an appeal to people who felt neglected and who felt sort of on the margins of American politics recently, white working class folks. And so, you know, in that way, there is a little bit of a parallel.
I think that the appeals to the victimization, that vague sense of victimization that forces beyond our control, in international capitalism in the 1920s, 1930s, comparable to the so-called Davos agenda today, who's benefiting from globalization. Sort of vague anger about NAFTA, although you can't really explain exactly what the problem is. But
and I like the comment that you made earlier, Mike, about the simultaneous use of a sense of victimization, but strength at the same time, right? You know, and that, I think that is definitely a strong parallel that we're seeing here. I saw a question on the end.
You know, like to end sort of with a little note of hopefulness here, because we have to maintain hope after all, right? So what I notice is that with these countries that you've been talking about, there's been a propensity, or a history at least, for people to follow authoritarian, because they had monarchies often, and patriarchy, and fascist and strong rulers, authoritarian rulers. this country was founded on the democratic principles and freedom. And we forget that as vocal as they may be, the solid followers of Trump who will take up arms if anything happens to them or whatever, is a minority. And the majority of Americans are, value the freedom and would abhor a dictatorship or an authoritarian rule in this country just on the face of it. So, and yet we are seeing some inroads here and there. So what does the panel think as far as the likelihood this kind of beginning movement here can really ever have any traction in this country versus these other countries where, it's sort of more easily happen, whereas here I think there's going to be more resistance?
I mean, this speaks to the use of history and politics as a national mythology. I mean, it's a country founded in freedom for men that look like me of a certain amount of property.
Yeah.
And no American has been on a war about this, and then it actually didn't really fix anything for another 100 years. Then maybe kind of, I don't know if you've been following the news the past couple of years. I think that white supremacist republics are a very real phenomenon throughout world history, and
but they can often take hold in countries that are used to authoritarian rule, whereas this country, not so much.
But I think
We are getting away, aren't we evolving away from the...
You need to think about institutions, too.
Yeah.
I mean, structures, economic structures, institutions. I mean, I think that the democracy we have here institutionally has pretty deep roots. In Argentina, it didn't.
Yeah, so I guess I want to build on what you asked. I think we'll make this the last question since we've kind of run over a little bit here. But I too wanted to at least bring up some of the resistance to the Trump administration's agenda that we've seen on a lot of different levels, right? I mean, on the one hand, the media has proven itself, the mainstream media has proven itself quite willing to call the Trump administration out when they see direct lies being forwarded as the truth. We saw the Ninth Circuit block the Trump administration's immigration rules and at least slow down the process, if not stop it with a reflection on our Constitution. And there's also been large protest movements. Maybe some people in this room have participated then out in the streets or in town halls. So I guess my question is not so much about the American electorate versus the Weimar German or the Peronist electorate, but about American civil society and democratic institutions. So maybe we'll start with Jeff and work our way through. Can we rest a little bit easy tonight in the thought that these are more secure in the United States, or do we need to walk out of here a little bit more unsettled?
Well, I mean, I think I'd take an issue a little bit with your sort of characterization of countries where fascism emerged as having a long tradition of sort of not being democratic.
We had kings in their past.
Yeah, well, sure, that's true. But, I think an important characteristic of fascism is that it is a response to a crisis of democracy. It's a response to sort of breakdown of democratic mechanism. I mean, this is what happened in Weimar Germany, where, starting in 1930 during the Depression, liberals and socialists couldn't agree on, what economic measures to take, and, the government was stalled in gridlock as this economic crisis sort of spiraled out of control. And, as a response to that then, Nazism with its sort of radical solutions that it offered, was appealing. So, I think we need to be careful about sort of priding ourselves too much on our sort of democratic tradition. I mean, the democratic tradition is only as good as, the people who are willing to stand up and defend it. And in Germany, in January of 1930, when Hitler becomes chancellor, there are plenty of sort of newspaper op-eds that say, oh, Germany will never become a dictatorship. Hitler may have these aspirations, but there are too many institutional barriers, and Germany is too much of a society. I mean, Germany had while maybe not a long tradition of sort of democratic governance, had a long tradition of the rule of law and prided itself as a country that operated by the rule of law, which the Nazis sort of promptly threw out. It was also a country that, while not governed democratically had a long experience, a fairly long experience of democracy going back to the late 1860s. Not that, I mean, the United States doesn't become a democracy much before that. So, the Germans felt fairly confident, or many Germans, even on the left, felt fairly confident that, things weren't going to fall apart, and yet events got away from them in surprising ways. So I think this is a moment that calls for vigilance. I think particularly when Trump attacks, the institutions central to democracy, when he attacks the press, when he attacks the judiciary, when he attacks checks on his power. I mean, these are things that should give, everyone, cause for concern.
I don't read political tea leaves, but what I do, I would echo a lot of what Jeff just said. Although I do acknowledge the vigilance, I do have a lot of confidence in our institutions and the people who we elect to be in those institutions, who get those positions, as voicing the needs of the United States as opposed to the needs of a single individual.
Well, history is full of democracies that committed suicide, or republics that committed suicide. Athens, the Roman Republic, the French Republic with the rise of Napoleon, Weimar Germany. All we need is our Reichstag fire. Yesterday was the 75th anniversary of FDR's signing of the order to intern Japanese in the United States. I think that democracy is a very, very fragile institution that has to be supported. And I'm supposed to be brief, but what on earth does this Make America Great Again statement refer to? What was going on in some moment when America was great? Chances are it was great for people that look just like me with a certain amount of wealth. And I think that's the real danger, is a limited rollback of what the United States provides for its citizens and non-citizens.
Dr. Fields will give you the last word here today.
Oh boy, I wasn't going to really say much here because I'm hopeful, but I'm also cautious. I think Jeff really put it well, that we need to. There is a kind of a slow drip happening that we really need to be aware of. And I am maybe not as optimistic about the political mathematics right now as Katerina is. Congress is a mess. And Congress should be a check on the president, and that is not happening right now at all. That's a problem. The press and the courts, let's hope.
All right, can you please join me in thanking our panel?